Good morning.
Good morning.
It's a little chilly, but let's turn up the heat in here a little bit because we have a very important guest speaker in just a moment. But I wanted to just make a couple of remarks. Again, I'm Paul Burns. I'm the Executive Director of VPIRG, the Vermont Public Interest Research Group. VPIRG is one of the co-hosting organizations here today. As co-hosting and co-sponsoring organizations, you see some of the banners there in back, we recognize that we work on an incredibly diverse array of issues. But we are all united in the belief that by working together, we are stronger. We know all about the attacks that we face every day. So now is the time to stand up for what we believe in. Climate change is real. Healthcare is a right. Our water must be safe to drink, and there is no place for racism or hate here. Now, these are not radical ideas. In fact, they are rooted in the very values that all of us share. And if we respect our neighbors and our fellow citizens enough to engage with them on these issues, then they will become a very powerful force for change. And speaking of powerful forces for change, I just want to say that as we, as organizers, were thinking about, gosh, who could we get to be the keynote speaker at an event like this with such wide-ranging interests and areas of focus? Who could that possibly be? Who could speak with passion, with knowledge, and with moral clarity to advance us on these causes? Who could that be? Well, you know, it turns out that we did have somebody in mind and that we could find somebody who is actually pretty close to home, even though we now share him with the rest of the world. I am so happy, I am so honored to introduce to you our friend, our champion, our Senator, Bernie Sanders.
Thank you all very much for inviting me. And let me begin by thanking you for understanding the importance of what we call coalition politics. You all know what that means? What coalition politics means is that if you dig deep, right within this room, you're going to find differences of opinion on this issue and on that issue. But at the end of the day, you're also going to find that on the most important issues facing our country, there is widespread agreement. And what is most important when we talk about going forward politically is not to allow this issue to divide us up, but to allow the broad progressive agenda to bring us together. Sometimes that does not happen. I have literally heard people say, well, you know, I agree with candidate X on 99% of the issues. I just can't vote for her. There's that one issue I disagree on. That can't be allowed to happen. And as someone who has traveled all across this country, let me give you some very good news. And despite what you may read in the media about how the country is all divided, and there are issues out there where the country is divided, on the vast majority of the issues facing this country, there is a lot more commonality than you might think that there is. I think the vast majority of the American people, and maybe what Tuesday was about, are rejecting Trump's idea that the future of America is to divide us up based on the color of our skin, the country we were born in, our sexual orientation, our religion, and the American people say, no, that is not what we will allow to happen in this country. And what the American people also know, and this is true whether you're progressive, whether you're conservative, Democrat, Republican, independent, they understand the absolutely horrendous impact that big money is playing in our political process and the need to overturn this disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision. For several hundred years in Vermont, we have been very proud that small towns on a Tuesday in March come together at town meeting to discuss the future of their communities. One person, one vote, not billionaires buying elections. Just to give you an example, I know the issue of money in politics does not seem to be a sexy issue, but it is an issue which permeates every other issue. Let me give you some examples. Just this week, if you watch this stuff closely, right now in the Senate, there is a big debate about tax reform. And in my view, the tax reform program brought forth by Trump and the Republicans is a disaster. Massive tax breaks to billionaires. A lot of working people are going to end up paying more in taxes. Massive cuts to corporate income tax, moving in exactly the wrong direction. But be that as it may, what was interesting is during the week, a number of Republicans were honest enough to get up and say, you know what? Our donors, our campaign contributors say that if we do not pass this legislation, they're going to stop funding us. Nobody in America, or very few people in America, not in Vermont, not in California, not in Utah, Idaho, Wyoming, Mississippi, very few people believe that you give massive tax breaks to billionaires and then cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which is exactly what the Republican agenda is about. How does that happen? It happens because that is the agenda of the billionaire class and the Koch brothers. And what you have now in Washington is a legislative agenda that does not represent the vast majority of the people. It represents the people on top who make hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign contributions. But by the way, this is not just the Republican Party.
Right.
Just yesterday was a guy on TV, and he was saying, I talked to Chuck and Nancy, and if I told them that if they don't move away from this progressive idea of taking on millionaires and billionaires, I'm going to cut their funding.
Ooh.
We're going to cut them off. There's never Democrat.
Yep.
And our job is to tell the billionaires in both parties to get the hell out of politics, let the American people determine our future. And what is the agenda that brings the American people together? And it's not hard. We all know what it is. At a time of massive income and wealth inequality. Some of you see the recent report about the Paradise Papers. You see that?
Yes.
They are telling us, and other reports are telling us, that throughout the world, not just in the United States, over $20 trillion are being parked, stashed in offshore tax havens by large corporations and the wealthy in order to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. Over $20 trillion. And then you got governments in the United States and the UK and elsewhere that go around to, oh, we can't afford to take care of the children or the elderly or our veterans. We don't have the money. And the big money interests doing everything they can to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. And what the American people are saying overwhelmingly, no matter what their ideology is that at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, yes, the wealthiest people in large corporations will start to pay their fair share of taxes. That brings us together. Second area, a couple of weeks ago, I went north to Toronto. And what I saw there, and of course you all know this, is that in Canada, they managed to provide health care to every man, woman, and child, quality care to all of their people at half of the cost that we spend per capita in the United States of America. And the American people are catching on, and it's a beautiful thing to see all over this country. Healthcare is a right, not a privilege. The function of healthcare is to provide quality care to all of us, not to make huge profits for insurance companies and drug companies. As Paul just mentioned a moment ago, despite what Trump and his friends at the EPA now may think, the American people fully understand that climate change is real. And I was in Puerto Rico a couple of weeks ago, and the devastation that climate change has done there in exacerbating the hurricane that they experienced, Hurricane Maria. All over the world, people understand that our job now is to take on the fossil fuel industry, to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency, sustainable energy, and make sure that we can create millions of jobs by doing just that. That's what the American people understand. The American people understand that in a highly competitive global economy, we have got to have the best educated workforce in the world. Technology is changing the way people do work, the nature of the jobs being created. We have got to educate our young people to be able to do those jobs. And that takes us to another area. And all of these things are related to each other. We have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth. The way we treat our children is a national and international disgrace. And that is across the board. There is no reason why in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, which is what we are today, that we cannot have universal, high-quality child care and pre-K education for our children. And then at the other end of the educational spectrum, today we have hundreds of thousands of bright young people, kids in Vermont and all over this country, who are not getting a higher education because their families cannot afford it. There are people leaving college or graduate school many hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. That is insane. That is not the way you address a competitive global economy. I want everybody in this country to get all of the education they need. That is not a radical idea. That's what a sane country does if you want a strong economy and a democratic society. That's why we're going to make public colleges. Why we're going to make public colleges and universities tuition free.
Yeah.
Now, one of them, we talk about politics, and we talk about coalition politics. There's another thing that we've got to understand. And that is, when you pick up the front pages of the paper, you look on television, you're not necessarily seeing what is really going on. You have got to determine what the issues of the day are, and not just the front pages of the paper. And what I am seeing, and it's really a beautiful thing to see, is we are now beginning to see all across this country more and more people getting involved in the political process. Ideas that a few years ago seemed so radical now are becoming mainstream. If I were before you 5-6 years ago, and I said that we should raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, you would have thought I was nuts, that it was too radical an idea. Yet I want you to know from coast to coast, $15 an hour is what communities are now doing, states are now doing, candidates are now espousing. 5 years ago, a radical idea, today mainstream, because the American people are getting involved in the political process. And if I were... And when we talk about making public colleges and universities tuition-free, oh, that's such a radical idea, can't happen. A couple of months ago, I was at San Francisco City College. And that community, San Francisco, made their City College 2-year school tuition-free. They increased their enrollment for San Francisco residents by over 50%. I just received an invitation to go to Milwaukee. They did the same thing. New York State, making public colleges and universities tuition-free. Tennessee, Republican state, community colleges tuition-free. What is the point of the whole thing? The whole point is that you have an economic system, a political system, and a media system that wants essentially to tell you that you are powerless. You don't got a couple of $100 million, don't get involved in politics. You're not a billionaire, don't run for office. That's what they are trying to tell you. And our job is to do exactly the opposite. Our job is to understand that this is what the history of this country is about, whether it's the history of the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay movement, the environmental movement. The history of all progress always is that when working people and young people stand up and fight back, that is when change takes place, and that's the only way that change ever takes place. Our job now, let me conclude by saying this, is not just every day to take on the racism and the sexism and the homophobia and the xenophobia and the bigotry of the Trump administration. We have got to do that every single day. But the other thing that we have got to do simultaneously is bring forth an agenda that makes sense to ordinary people, whether they're black or white or Latino, Asian America, Native American, whatever it may be. And that is a progressive agenda, and I've just talked about some of the issues. But it is an agenda that says ultimately that we must have an economy and that we must have a government that works for all of us, not just the 1%. Thank you all very much.